The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as tourists began gathering for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood a small family from Ohio, their eyes wide with excitement at seeing London's most famous attraction. 8-year-old Emma clutched her stuffed bear tightly, her blonde pigtails bouncing as she tried to get a better view of the imposing guards in their red coats and tall black hats. Guard James Mitchell had been standing at his post for nearly 2 hours. His feet ached inside his polished black boots, but his face remained expressionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead. This was his 3rd year serving in the Queen's Guard, and he had perfected the art of remaining completely still despite the crowds, cameras, and occasional attempts by tourists to make him react. Emma's parents were busy taking photos of the palace gates when she noticed something that made her heart sink. Her beloved teddy bear, Mr. Snuggles, had somehow slipped from her grasp and landed just inside the palace railings, completely out of reach. The bear had been her constant companion since she was 3 years old, a gift from her grandmother who had passed away the previous year. Tears began rolling down Emma's cheeks as she pressed her face against the cold metal bars, stretching her small arm desperately toward the brown teddy bear that lay just 2 feet away but might as well have been on the moon. Her parents, distracted by the spectacle around them, hadn't yet noticed their daughter's distress. Several tourists walked past, some glancing sympathetically at the crying child but unsure how to help. The palace railings were there for security reasons, and retrieving items that fell through was not something ordinary visitors could do. Emma's sobs grew louder, attracting more attention from the gathering crowd. Guard Mitchell, despite his training to remain motionless and ignore distractions, found himself acutely aware of the little girl's crying. From the corner of his eye, he could see her small frame shaking with each sob, her face red and tear-streaked. Something deep inside him, perhaps memories of his own young niece back home, stirred emotions that threatened to break through his professional composure. Rules were clear. Guards were not to move, speak, or interact with the public except in cases of immediate security threats. Breaking these rules could result in serious disciplinary action, possibly even dismissal from the prestigious position. Yet as Emma's cries continued, Mitchell found himself questioning whether following protocol was always the right thing to do. Other guards had faced similar situations before. There were stories whispered in the barracks about colleagues who had bent the rules slightly. A subtle nod to acknowledge a veteran's salute, a barely perceptible smile for a child's wave. But this situation was different. This would require deliberate action, clear violation of standing orders. Emma's father finally noticed his daughter's distress and knelt beside her, trying to understand what had happened. When he saw the teddy bear lying inside the palace grounds, his face fell. He knew there was nothing he could do. Security protocols were strict, and he certainly couldn't climb over the railings or expect anyone else to risk their job for a stuffed animal. The crowd around them grew larger, with people pointing and murmuring about the situation. Some took photos, others offered suggestions, but everyone seemed to understand that the bear was lost forever. Emma's mother arrived, having heard the commotion, and immediately wrapped her arms around her sobbing daughter. Guard Mitchell's internal struggle intensified. He thought about his own childhood, about the special toys that had comforted him during difficult times. He remembered the stories his grandmother had told him about kindness being more important than rules, about moments when humanity should triumph over protocol. His hands, holding his ceremonial rifle, began to feel heavier. The little girl's sobs echoed off the palace walls, creating a sound that seemed to penetrate the very stone foundations of the ancient building. Mitchell had witnessed many emotional moments during his service. Proposals, reunions, farewells, but something about this innocent child's pure heartbreak was different. It cut through his professional armor like nothing ever had. As minutes passed, Emma's crying began to subside into quiet hiccups, but her eyes remained fixed on Mr. Snuggles lying motionless on the grass. Her parents exchanged helpless glances, knowing they would soon have to lead their daughter away and somehow explain why her precious bear couldn't come home with them. The other guards at nearby posts were also aware of the situation, though they maintained their rigid stances. Mitchell could sense their discomfort, their own internal battles between duty and compassion. The weight of tradition, of centuries of protocol and discipline, pressed down on all of them like an invisible force. But in that moment, something shifted in Guard Mitchell's mind. He thought about why he had joined the service in the first place, not just to follow orders blindly, but to protect and serve, to represent the best qualities of his nation. Sometimes, he realized, the most important service came not from following rules, but from recognizing when human compassion should take precedence. The crowd had grown quiet, sensing the tension in the air. Even the clicking of camera shutters seemed muted as everyone watched the silent drama unfolding. Emma had stopped crying but continued to stare longingly at her lost companion, her small hand pressed against the railings. Guard Mitchell made a decision that would change not only that little girl's day, but also his own understanding of what it truly meant to serve with honor. The rigid training, the months of discipline, the fear of consequences, all of it paled in comparison to the simple human need to help a child in distress. As he prepared to take action, Mitchell knew he was about to cross a line that could not be uncrossed. But looking at Emma's tear-stained face, he also knew it was the right thing to do, regardless of the consequences that might follow. The tension in the air was thick as Guard Mitchell made his choice. With deliberate slowness, he began to move from his rigid position, each step carefully calculated to maintain dignity while breaking centuries of protocol. The crowd, initially confused, began to realize what was happening. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered tourists as they witnessed something unprecedented. Emma looked up in wonder as the tall soldier in his magnificent red coat approached, the railings from the inside. Her tears stopped flowing, replaced by wide-eyed amazement. She had never imagined that one of these statue-like figures could actually move, let alone come to help her. Her small hands gripped the metal bars tighter as she watched the guard bend down gracefully and pick up Mr. Snuggles. Guard Mitchell's heart pounded beneath his formal uniform, but his movements remained controlled and dignified. He understood the magnitude of what he was doing. Every eye in the crowd was upon him. Every smartphone camera was likely recording this moment that would soon spread across social media platforms worldwide. Yet all he could focus on was the little girl's face, transformed from despair to hope. As he approached the railings, Mitchell knelt down to Emma's eye level, still maintaining the formal bearing of his position. Without speaking, for even in this moment of rule-breaking, some protocols remained, he carefully passed the teddy bear through the railings into Emma's waiting arms. The relief and joy that flooded the child's face was worth every potential consequence he might face. Emma hugged Mr. Snuggles tightly, her tears now tears of happiness. She looked up at the guard with pure adoration and whispered a barely audible, "Thank you." Though Mitchell couldn't respond verbally, a barely perceptible nod acknowledged her gratitude. For a brief moment, the formal barriers between guard and civilian dissolved, replaced by a simple human connection. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. Tourists from around the world, who had come to London expecting to see ceremony and tradition, instead witnessed something far more powerful: compassion triumphing over convention. Cameras flashed and phones recorded as people realized they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered long after the formal ceremonies were forgotten. Mitchell slowly rose and returned to his position, resuming his statue-like stance as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The other guards at nearby posts had witnessed the entire event, and while they couldn't show it, Each felt a surge of pride for their colleague's actions. They understood the risk he had taken, the courage it required to choose kindness over following orders. Emma's parents were overwhelmed with gratitude. Her father, a veteran himself, understood the significance of what the guard had done. He knew about military discipline, about the importance of following orders, and he recognized the personal sacrifice involved in the soldier's decision. Emma's mother wiped tears from her own eyes as she watched her daughter's joy. Word of the incident began spreading quickly through the crowd. Tourists shared the story with others, describing how they had witnessed a moment of pure human kindness. Social media posts began appearing within minutes, with videos and photos capturing the guard's compassionate act. The hashtag, kindness over protocol, began trending almost immediately, but the immediate aftermath was not Mitchell's primary concern. He stood at his post, maintaining perfect posture, while internally preparing for whatever consequences might follow. He knew his commanding officers would likely hear about this incident within hours. The palace had security cameras, and hundreds of witnesses had documented everything. There was no hiding what he had done. The other guards continued their duties, but each was affected by what they had witnessed. Private Thompson, stationed 50 meters away, found himself thinking about his own daughter back home. Corporal Williams remembered his grandmother's teachings about always helping those in need. The ripple effect of one act of kindness was already spreading through their ranks. As the morning progressed, more visitors heard about what had happened. People began approaching Emma's family, wanting to hear the story firsthand. The little girl, still clutching Mr. Snuggles, became an unwitting celebrity. Her parents handled the attention gracefully, always making sure to emphasize the guard's incredible act of kindness. Several hours later, when Mitchell's shift was nearing its end, he noticed increased activity among the palace staff. Supervisors were having quiet conversations, and there seemed to be more officials than usual observing the guards. He suspected word had reached the higher levels of command, and he mentally prepared himself for a difficult conversation. The changing of the guard ceremony that afternoon drew an unusually large crowd. Word had spread about the morning's events, and many people came hoping to see the guard who had helped the little girl. Mitchell, however, was rotated to a different position, a standard practice that took on new significance given the circumstances. Tourists continued to gather throughout the day. Many asked about the hero guard who had rescued the teddy bear. The story grew with each telling, becoming part of the palace's unofficial history. Tour guides began incorporating the tale into their commentary, describing it as an example of British compassion and humanity. Emma and her family spent the rest of their London visit telling everyone they met about the kind soldier. They visited other attractions, but nothing compared to their experience at Buckingham Palace. The little girl carried Mr. Snuggles everywhere, and whenever anyone asked about the bear, she would proudly tell them about the nice guard who saved him. Back in the barracks that evening, Mitchell's fellow guards gathered around him. Instead of criticism or concern about his rule-breaking, he found support and admiration. Many shared their own stories of moments when they had wanted to help but hadn't found the courage to act. Mitchell's actions had given them all something to think about regarding the balance between duty and humanity. The story continued to spread online throughout the evening. International news outlets picked up the story, with headlines celebrating the guard's compassionate act. Comments poured in from around the world, with people sharing their own experiences of unexpected kindness from strangers. The simple act of returning a teddy bear had become a symbol of hope in a world that often seemed dominated by rigid rules and cold institutions. As Mitchell lay in his bunk that night, he thought about Emma's smile and the warmth he had felt when making his decision. Regardless of what consequences awaited him, he knew he had done the right thing. Sometimes the most important moments in life came not from following the rule book, but from following the heart. The next morning brought unexpected developments that no one could have predicted. Guard Mitchell reported for duty expecting to face disciplinary action, possibly even dismissal from his prestigious position. Instead, he found himself summoned to the office of Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer of the Queen's Guard, whose reputation for strict adherence to protocol was legendary throughout the military. Colonel Harrison, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, sat behind his mahogany desk reviewing a stack of papers and printouts from social media posts. The walls of his office were lined with portraits of former commanders and ceremonial weapons, creating an atmosphere that spoke of centuries of military tradition and unwavering discipline. Mitchell stood at attention, his mind racing through possible outcomes. He had spent the sleepless night mentally preparing his defense, thinking about how to explain his actions without sounding insubordinate. Yet as he stood there, he felt no regret about helping Emma retrieve her teddy bear. If anything, the passage of time had only strengthened his conviction that he had made the right choice. The colonel looked up from his papers and studied Mitchell's face for several long moments. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the ticking of an antique clock on the bookshelf. Finally, Harrison spoke in his characteristic measured tone that had intimidated countless soldiers over his 30-year career. "Guardsman Mitchell, I assume you know why you're here?" the colonel began, his expression unreadable. "Your actions yesterday morning have created quite a stir. I've received calls from journalists, messages from palace officials, and reports from your commanding officers. The incident has been viewed millions of times online and has made international news." Mitchell maintained his rigid posture and replied, "Yes, sir. I understand my actions violated standing protocol. I accept full responsibility for my decision and am prepared to face whatever consequences you deem appropriate." What happened next surprised everyone in the room, including the colonel's aide who had been present for countless disciplinary meetings. Colonel Harrison's stern expression softened slightly, and something resembling a smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. He set down the papers and leaned back in his chair, a gesture that Mitchell had never seen him make in formal meetings. "Tell me, Mitchell," the colonel continued, "what went through your mind when you saw that little girl crying? What made you decide that helping her was worth risking your career, your reputation, and the integrity of protocols that have been maintained for generations?" The question caught Mitchell off guard. He had expected accusations and formal charges, not an invitation. To explain his reasoning, he took a moment to collect his thoughts before responding honestly about the internal struggle he had experienced and the moment when compassion had triumphed over fear. As Mitchell spoke about Emma's tears, about thinking of his own family, and about his belief that true service sometimes required courage to act beyond the rulebook, Colonel Harrison listened intently. The older man's expression revealed nothing, but his attention suggested he was weighing each word carefully. When Mitchell finished speaking, the colonel stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace courtyard, where guards were conducting their morning duties. For several minutes, he watched the familiar routines that he had overseen for years, the precise movements and unwavering discipline that defined the Queen's Guard. "Guardsman Mitchell," the colonel said without turning around, "do you know why these protocols exist? Why we maintain such rigid standards of behavior and appearance?" Without waiting for an answer, he continued, "It's not simply about tradition or ceremony. These rules exist because the Queen's Guard represents something larger than any individual soldier. We are symbols of reliability, of unwavering dedication to duty." Mitchell braced himself for the inevitable punishment, but the colonel's next words took him completely by surprise. "However," Harrison continued, turning back to face Mitchell, "I've been thinking about this incident all night. I've read the responses from people around the world, seen the comments from parents thanking you for showing their children that kindness matters more than rules. I've received messages from veterans expressing pride in your actions, and from civilians saying they feel more connected to their military because of what you did." The colonel returned to his desk and picked up a particular printout, a news Article with the headline, British Guard Shows World the True Meaning of Service. He read aloud some of the comments from readers, stories of how Mitchell's simple act had inspired others to show kindness in their own lives. What you did yesterday, Mitchell, was not just about returning a teddy bear to a crying child. You reminded the world that behind these ceremonial uniforms are human beings with hearts and consciences. You showed that true honor sometimes requires the courage to prioritize compassion over compliance. The aide in the corner looked surprised by the colonel's words. This was not the typical outcome of a protocol violation meeting, but Colonel Harrison had served long enough to understand that leadership sometimes meant recognizing when rules should bend in service of higher principles. "Sir," Mitchell ventured carefully, "does this mean I won't face disciplinary action?" Colonel Harrison sat down and pulled out a formal document from his desk drawer. Mitchell's heart sank, assuming it was his dismissal papers. Instead, the colonel began reading from what appeared to be a commendation. "Guardsman James Mitchell," the colonel read formally, "for demonstrating exceptional judgment in balancing military protocol with humanitarian compassion, for representing the finest qualities of British military service, and for reminding the world that true strength lies in knowing when to be flexible. You are hereby commended for distinguished service." Mitchell's eyes widened in disbelief. Not only was he not being punished, but he was being officially recognized for his actions. The colonel explained that after consulting with higher authorities, including palace officials and senior military leadership, the decision had been made to acknowledge that sometimes the greatest service to the crown came through acts of genuine, human kindness. The colonel went on to explain that Mitchell's actions had generated overwhelmingly positive publicity for the Queen's Guard and the British military as a whole. Public support for the Guards had increased dramatically, with many people expressing new respect and admiration for the human side of these traditionally stoic figures. "There will be some changes to our protocols," Colonel Harrison continued. "We're developing new guidelines that will allow guards more discretion in situations involving genuine human distress, particularly when children are involved. Your actions yesterday have helped us recognize that strict adherence to rules should never prevent us from showing basic human decency." The meeting concluded with handshakes and congratulations from the colonel and his staff. As Mitchell left the office, he felt a mixture of relief, pride, and amazement at how events had unfolded. The simple decision to help a crying child had not only avoided punishment, but had actually led to positive changes in military protocol. In the weeks following the teddy bear incident, something remarkable began happening at Buckingham Palace and other royal residences throughout Britain. Guards who had spent years maintaining rigid, emotionless facades started experiencing moments where their humanity shone through their ceremonial duties. Mitchell's brave act had opened a door that could never be fully closed again. Guard Sarah Thompson was the first to follow Mitchell's example. During her afternoon shift at Windsor Castle, she noticed an elderly man in a wheelchair struggling to take a photograph with the castle gates in the background. His hands shook with what appeared to be Parkinson's disease, making it impossible for him to hold his phone steady. The man's wife looked on helplessly, unsure how to assist. Thompson remembered Mitchell's story and the new guidelines that had been quietly circulated among the guards. Without breaking her formal stance entirely, she caught the attention of a nearby palace staff member with a subtle gesture and nodded toward the struggling couple. Within minutes, a photographer appeared to help capture the moment the elderly visitors had traveled hundreds of miles to achieve. The grateful tears in the old man's eyes reminded Thompson why she had joined the service in the first place. It wasn't just about standing motionless for hours or looking impressive for tourists. It was about serving people, about representing the best qualities of her nation, and sometimes that meant finding ways to help without compromising the dignity of her position. Word of these small acts of kindness spread through the guard community like wildfire. At the Tower of London, guard David Chen helped reunite a lost child with his panicked parents by discreetly alerting security personnel. At Horse Guards Parade, guard Maria Santos noticed a young soldier's mother crying as she watched her son's first ceremonial duty, overwhelmed with pride and worry. Santos managed to catch the mother's eye and offer an almost imperceptible nod of reassurance that everything would be fine. The changes weren't limited to interactions with the public. Within the guard community itself, Mitchell's example had sparked conversations about the balance between duty and humanity that had been suppressed for generations. Guards began sharing stories of moments when they had wanted to help but had felt constrained by protocol. They discussed ways to maintain their ceremonial dignity while still acknowledging the human connections that made their service meaningful. Colonel Harrison, initially concerned about maintaining discipline while allowing for compassionate flexibility, was amazed by how responsibly the guards handled their new discretionary powers. Rather than leading to chaos or a breakdown in protocol, the changes had actually strengthened morale and increased public support for the guard units. The media coverage continued to be overwhelmingly positive. Feature articles appeared in newspapers around the world, describing the new face of the Queen's Guard and praising the British military for recognizing that strength and compassion were not mutually exclusive. Tourism to royal sites increased as people hoped to witness these moments of human connection. Emma and her family had returned to Ohio, but they maintained contact with several people they had met in London. Emma's mother posted regular updates on social media about how the experience had affected their daughter. The little girl had become something of a local celebrity, sharing her story at school and inspiring other children to believe in the power of kindness from strangers. Mr. Snuggles, the teddy bear that had started it all, now held a place of honor in Emma's bedroom. She had told everyone who would listen about the nice soldier who saved my bear, and her simple story had reached thousands of people through social media shares and local news coverage. What struck most people was the pure innocence of her perspective. She didn't see Mitchell's act as rule-breaking or protocol-violating, but simply as one person helping another. The ripple effects extended far beyond the military. Teachers began using Mitchell's story as an example of moral courage in schools across Britain and beyond. They discussed with their students how sometimes doing the right thing required questioning rules and choosing compassion over convenience. Children wrote letters to the Queen's Guard, sharing their own experiences of kindness and expressing appreciation for the Guard's service. Corporate trainers incorporated the incident into leadership seminars, using it to illustrate the importance of employee empowerment and the value of allowing frontline workers to make compassionate decisions. The story became a case study in business schools about how organizations could maintain standards while still encouraging human connection and flexibility. Religious leaders from various faiths referenced Mitchell's actions in sermons about putting love into practice and serving others without expectation of reward. The simple act of returning a stuffed animal had become a universal symbol of the principle that rules should serve humanity, not the other way around. Meanwhile, Mitchell continued his duties with a new sense of purpose. He found that tourists now looked at him differently, not as a statue to photograph, but as a person who represented the best qualities of service and compassion. Children would wave at him with special enthusiasm, and their parents would point him out as an example of kindness and courage. Other guards began sharing their own stories with Mitchell during off-duty hours. They told him about moments when his example had inspired them to find creative ways to help others while maintaining their professional responsibilities. A culture of compassionate service was emerging within the ranks, transforming not just how they interacted with the public, but how they supported each other. The changes weren't without challenges. Some traditionalists within the military hierarchy worried about maintaining discipline and the dignity of ceremonial positions. However, the overwhelming public support and the positive impact on guard morale made it clear that the modifications were strengthening rather than weakening the institution. Training programs began incorporating discussions about situational ethics, and appropriate responses to human distress. New guards learned not just about standing at attention and following orders, but about representing their nation's values of compassion and service. The curriculum evolved to include scenarios where guards might need to balance protocol with humanitarian concern. As months passed, the kindness over protocol philosophy became deeply embedded in the culture of the Queen's Guard. What had started as one soldier's spontaneous decision to help a crying child had evolved into a new understanding of what it meant to serve with honor. The guards had learned that true strength came not from rigid inflexibility, but from the wisdom to know when compassion should guide their actions. The transformation was subtle but profound. Visitors to royal sites began reporting more positive interactions with guards, and recruitment for the prestigious positions increased as young people were drawn to an organization that valued both discipline and humanity. The Queen's Guard had maintained its legendary professionalism while adding a new dimension of compassionate service that resonated with people around the world. 6 months after the teddy bear incident, an envelope bearing the royal seal arrived at Guard Mitchell's barracks. The formal invitation, written in elegant calligraphy, requested his presence at a private reception at Buckingham Palace. The purpose was not specified, but the significance of being personally invited by members of the royal family was not lost on anyone who saw the invitation. Mitchell's fellow guards gathered around him in amazement as he read the invitation aloud. In their years of service, none had ever received such a personal acknowledgement from the royal household. The invitation was not just for Mitchell, but extended to include the American family whose experience inspired such exemplary service, Emma. And her parents had also been invited to return to London as honored guests. The weeks leading up to the reception were filled with preparation and anticipation. Emma's family back in Ohio could hardly believe they were being invited to meet members of the royal family. For them, the London trip had been a once-in-a-lifetime vacation, and they had never imagined it would lead to such extraordinary recognition. Emma, now 9 years old, had grown even more confident and outgoing since her experience in London. She had continued sharing her story at school and in her community, always emphasizing how one person's kindness could make such a difference. Mr. Snuggles remained her constant companion, and she had decided he needed to look his best for meeting the royal family, so her mother carefully cleaned and groomed the well-loved teddy bear. On the day of the reception, Mitchell wore his finest dress uniform, every button polished to perfection and every crease precisely pressed. His parents had traveled from Scotland to London, their pride evident in every gesture as they accompanied their son to the palace. They had raised him to be kind and compassionate, but they never imagined those qualities would lead to recognition at the highest levels of British society. The reception was held in one of the palace's more intimate rooms, away from the public tours and formal ceremonies. The guest list was small, including Mitchell and his family, Emma's family, Colonel Harrison, and several palace officials who had been instrumental in the policy changes that followed Mitchell's actions. When the royal family member entered the room, everyone stood respectfully. The atmosphere was formal but warm, with a sense that this gathering was about celebrating something genuinely meaningful rather than fulfilling a ceremonial obligation. The royal representative had specifically requested this meeting after hearing about Mitchell's actions and the positive changes they had inspired. Emma, despite all her preparation and excitement, suddenly became shy in the presence of royalty. She clutched Mr. Snuggles tightly and stayed close to her parents, occasionally peeking out to look around the magnificent room with its priceless artwork and ornate furnishings. The grandeur was overwhelming, but the welcoming atmosphere helped ease her nervousness. The royal family member approached Mitchell first, acknowledging his service and the positive impact his actions had created. The conversation was genuine and personal, focusing not on the protocol violation aspects of the incident, but on the qualities of character and judgment that had guided Mitchell's decision. The recognition emphasized that true service sometimes required the courage to prioritize human need over rigid compliance. When it came time to meet Emma, the royal representative knelt down to the little girl's eye level, just as Mitchell had done months earlier at the palace railings. The gesture immediately put Emma at ease, and she began to share her story with the enthusiasm that had charmed everyone she had met since returning to Ohio. She introduced Mr. Snuggles and explained how the nice soldier had saved him from being lost forever. The royal family member listened intently to Emma's account, asking questions that showed genuine interest in her experience and how it had affected her. The conversation revealed how the incident had inspired Emma to look for ways to help others in her own community, from assisting classmates who were struggling to volunteering with her family at local charity events. Colonel Harrison was also recognized during the reception for his leadership in implementing the policy changes that had followed Mitchell's actions. The colonel, typically stern and reserved, showed visible emotion as he received acknowledgement for his wisdom in recognizing that true military strength included the flexibility to show compassion when circumstances warranted it. The highlight of the reception came when Mitchell was presented with a special commendation that would become part of his permanent service record. The citation specifically noted his exceptional demonstration of the finest qualities of British military service, showing that true honor lies in knowing when compassion should guide action. It was signed by senior military officials and palace representatives, making it one of the most meaningful recognitions a guard could receive. Emma received a special gift as well, a beautiful book about the history of Buckingham Palace, personally inscribed with gratitude for inspiring others. Through your story of kindness and friendship, the book would become one of her most treasured possessions, joining Mr. Snuggles as tangible reminders of their extraordinary London adventure. During the reception, guests were given a private tour of parts of the palace, normally closed to the public. Emma's eyes widened as she walked through rooms where kings and queens had lived and worked for centuries. She asked countless questions about the history and traditions, showing the curiosity and intelligence that had endeared her to everyone she met. The royal family members shared stories about the daily life of the palace, including interactions with the guards who provided security and maintained ceremonial duties. The conversation revealed a deep appreciation for the service provided by guards like Mitchell, and an understanding that their roles required not just physical presence, but sound judgment and genuine care for the people they served. As the reception drew to a close, photographs were taken to commemorate the occasion. The images would become treasured memories for both families. Mitchell standing proudly in his uniform next to his parents, Emma beaming as she held Mr. Snuggles while posing with royalty, and group shots that captured the warmth and significance of the gathering. The royal representative's closing remarks emphasized that Mitchell's actions had reminded everyone that the greatest traditions were not about rigid adherence to rules, but about maintaining the values that made those traditions meaningful. The guards served not just as ceremonial figures, but as representatives of the nation's character and values, including compassion and service to others. Emma's family was invited to return to London anytime as guests of the royal household, a gesture that moved them deeply. They had come to Britain as tourists and were leaving as friends, with connections that would last a lifetime. The experience had transformed their understanding of tradition, service, and the power of simple human kindness. As they prepared to leave the palace, Emma turned back for one last look at the magnificent building where her adventure had begun. She waved goodbye to the guards at their posts, and several subtly acknowledged her gesture, a small but meaningful sign of the changes that had taken place since that morning when tears over a lost teddy bear had touched one soldier's heart. 5 years had passed since the morning when Guard Mitchell chose kindness over protocol, and the ripple effects of his decision continued to spread in ways no one could have imagined. The story had become legendary, not just within military circles, but throughout British society and beyond, inspiring countless acts of compassion and fundamentally changing how people viewed the relationship between duty and humanity. Mitchell, now a sergeant, had become an unofficial ambassador for the new Queen's Guard. He regularly spoke at military academies, schools, and community organizations about the importance of moral courage and the power of individual actions to create positive change. His presentations always began with the simple truth that he had learned that day. Sometimes the most important service comes not from following orders, but from following your conscience. The changes within the Queen's Guard had evolved far beyond anyone's initial expectations. What started as modified protocols for handling distressed civilians had developed into a comprehensive approach to community engagement. Guards now participated in charity events, hospital visits, and school programs during their off-duty hours. The rigid separation between the ceremonial figures and the public had given way to a new model of accessible service. Emma, now 14 years old, had grown into a confident young woman who spoke regularly about kindness and community service. Mr. Snuggles, though showing signs of wear from years of love, still held a place of honor in her room. She had written a children's book about their London adventure, with proceeds going to charities that supported military families. The book had been translated into multiple languages and had inspired children around the world. The annual Kindness Over Protocol Award had been established in Mitchell's honor, recognizing military personnel who demonstrated exceptional judgment in balancing duty with compassion. Recipients came from all branches of service and from countries around the world, creating an international community of service members committed to leading with both strength and heart. Emma's family had maintained their friendship with Mitchell and his family, visiting London every few years and hosting them in Ohio. These relationships had deepened into genuine bonds that transcended the original incident. Emma considered Mitchell an honorary uncle, and he had watched with pride as she grew into a young woman who embodied the same qualities of empathy and courage that had brought them together. The story had been adapted into documentaries, books, and even a feature film that premiered at international film festivals. While Mitchell initially felt uncomfortable with the attention, he came to understand that the story's power lay not in celebrating him personally, but in demonstrating how ordinary people could make extraordinary differences through simple acts of kindness. Military recruitment had increased significantly in the years following the incident, with many young people citing Mitchell's example as inspiration for their desire to serve. The Queen's Guard had become one of the most sought-after positions in the British military, attracting candidates who were drawn not just by the prestige, but by the opportunity to serve in an organization that valued both excellence and compassion. Buckingham Palace had established a special program allowing children from around the world to visit and meet with the guards. These interactions, carefully structured to maintain security while encouraging human connection, had become some of the most popular and meaningful experiences available to young visitors to London. Children left these encounters with a new understanding of service, duty, and the importance of treating others with kindness. Colonel Harrison, now retired, had written a book about leadership and the importance of allowing subordinates to make moral decisions in complex situations. His work had become required reading at military academies worldwide, influencing a generation of officers to lead with both discipline and wisdom. He often reflected that one of his greatest achievements as a commander was recognizing that Mitchell's actions deserved praise rather than punishment. The guards themselves had developed a strong culture of mentorship and support, sharing stories and strategies for maintaining their high standards while remaining connected to their humanity. New guards were taught not just about ceremony and protocol, but about the responsibility they carried as representatives of their nation's values. The training emphasized that true strength came from knowing when to be flexible and when to stand firm. Mitchell's own family had been profoundly affected by the experience. His parents had become advocates for military families, using their son's story to highlight the character and dedication of service members. His younger sister had joined the military herself, inspired by her brother's example and the positive changes she had witnessed in military culture. The teddy bear incident had also influenced policy discussions at the highest levels of government. Politicians and policymakers referenced Mitchell's story when debating the balance between security measures and public access, using it as an example of how human judgment and compassion could enhance rather than undermine institutional effectiveness. International. Military exchanges had incorporated visits to witness the Queen's Guard's evolved approach to ceremonial duties. Military leaders from around the world came to study how traditional discipline could be maintained while encouraging appropriate flexibility and human connection. The model had been adapted by honor guards and ceremonial units in dozens of countries. Emma's school had established a Mitchell Award for students who demonstrated exceptional kindness and moral courage. Recipients were recognized for actions that showed they understood the difference between following rules and doing what was right. The award had inspired countless acts of kindness among students and had helped create a school culture focused on empathy and service. The story had become a case study in business schools and leadership programs, illustrating how individual actions could transform organizational culture. Companies around the world had implemented policies encouraging employees to use their judgment in serving customers and colleagues, recognizing that rigid adherence to rules could sometimes prevent excellent service. As Mitchell approached the 10-year anniversary of the incident, he often reflected on how one moment of decision had changed so many lives. He had never regretted his choice to help Emma, but he remained amazed by the far-reaching consequences of what seemed like such a simple act. The experience had taught him that individual actions, however small they might seem, could have profound impacts on the world. The legacy continued to grow as new generations discovered the story through social media, books, and documentaries. Each retelling inspired new acts of kindness and reinforced the message that protocol should serve humanity, not the other way around. The simple truth that Mitchell had demonstrated that day, that sometimes the greatest service comes from the courage to choose compassion, had become a guiding principle for people in all walks of life. Today, visitors to Buckingham Palace often ask their tour guides about the Teddy Bear Guard, and the story is shared with enthusiasm and pride. The guards on duty know they carry forward a tradition that honors both the dignity of their service and the importance of human connection. They stand at their posts with the knowledge that they represent not just ceremony and tradition, but the very best qualities of service, compassion, and moral courage. Mr. Snuggles, now carefully preserved in Emma's memory box, serves as a reminder that the smallest gestures can have the greatest impact. The worn teddy bear that once caused tears of distress had become a symbol of hope, proving that in a world that often seems dominated by rules and regulations, there is always room for kindness, always space for one person to make a difference in another's life.